Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for that. Yes, my name is Thomas Sheridan, if you haven't heard of me. I'll just assuming you don't. I'm from Dublin, Ireland, and when I was about 19, I played in a band and I ended up in New York, living a kind of a dream life. Being in a rock band in New York was amazing. Then when that all finished, studied graphic design. That was the rest of my career, was working in Wall Street. At the height of the boom, at the height of when these Wall Street companies were buying up nationalized companies all over the world and turning them into private corporations. Now I grew up in a pretty tough neighborhood, and I had a pretty, I had the typical kind of working class life, and it was like, I'd seen everything. I'd been in the music business. I thought I'd seen everything that there was to see in terms of human behavior and how people are. I thought it was kind of, everyone in the world was basically the same. There were people we were all generally people, but there were people who were difficult, there were people who were challenging, there were people who were great, most people were fine, and that's still true. However, when I was working on Wall Street, I encountered a very different kind of person. One day while I was working for an investment bank, there was this guy who was there who was trying to butter up to me, very glib, very charming, but also very intense. I never felt comfortable around him, no matter how friendly he tried to be. And one day out of the blue, he blurted out, "Hey, guess what? I'm a psychopath." And I laughed, but it was actually changing my life, because what happened then was I was opened up into a world that started to explain lots of things, what was wrong with this planet, why there was so much suffering in the world. Now, up at that point, like most of you here, I'm sure, when you hear psychopath, you hear Norman Bates, Jason from Friday the 13th, Ted Bundy. Well, yes, they are psychopaths too, but most psychopaths are not violent. This guy came from a wealthy Manhattan family. They had loads of money, and rich people in America don't go to prison, only poor people do. And so what happened was, instead of him, he went on a bender one weekend, stole a car, stole some credit cards, went crazy. Instead of going to jail, his family paid. And he ended up in a top Manhattan psychiatric clinic where they ran diagnostic testings on him. And he scored at the top of the psychopathology scale. Now, when he told me this, it was one of those things in your life where you suddenly go, there's something to this. And there's something about this that's important. And there's something about this that is revealing something down the road, but I'm not sure what it is yet. And that word psychopath never left my head when he said that. And then I asked him, is there anyone else in the building, on our department, who's also one? Because I reckon it's like gay guys can tell each other they have the gaydar. I reckon they might have something similar. And he says, yeah, he told me who they were. And funny enough, they were the same people who gave me the same reaction. Very glib, very superficial, but very intense. And being around them, I never felt relaxed, like we'd be doing, I'd be with them and they'd be doing a report and they'd be talking to me and they'd be all very cordial, they'd be writing, but there would be a way their hands would move. There was an intensity there that was very hard to explain. And I was almost getting this awareness that I was near an animal that was dangerous. And that actually will turn out to be true later on this talk. So that sort of like clicked something in my head, and I started to look at anything that appeared in like the New York Times or any kind of magazine like the New Scientist that mentioned anything to do with psychopaths. I just read it, and the more I read, the more I realized that this was a huge subject that academia kept to itself. And the more I read about it, and I managed to get my hands on some books. The first one was The Mask of Sanity, that was written in 1947 by a psychiatrist called Harvey Cleckley. And he was the first one to actually scientifically prove that what the term psychopath was. Up until that point, the term psychopath had been used since the late Victorian era. And it generally meant people who were morally insane. That was the original meaning of it. Or moral imbeciles. I'll explain this in a bit. And he actually came up with the description of a psychopath as being a person who has a sense of internal personality chaos, which they cover up by being a mimic of somebody else. And what that basically means is they do this purposefully to prey upon people. They create a fake persona, and that fake persona is specifically designed to manipulate and target other people. And you don't know that they exist until they reveal. Now, what I'm going to go about in the next few minutes before we get to the bigger picture is I'm going to say things that some of you might find disturbing, because some people hear this stuff and they go, am I one? Well, there's a golden test for that. If you think you're a psychopath, you're not. Or if you're worried about it, because they don't care that they are. They just do not care. To them, they're actually proud of it, most of them, because they see themselves as a kind of inside the king of the world who's, I have a secret no one else has, and I'm going to use and manipulate everybody. And they're looking at you and they're going, hey, how you doing? Very fake. And behind there, they're thinking of ways of using you and destroying you. And this may trigger memories of people that you knew in your life, a crazy relationship, someone that you knew that was very disruptive in your family. And I'm going to trigger these memories. Now remember, don't automatically think that they were a psychopath. And the more I started to realize and read about these things and read these books like Without Conscience by Dr. Robert Hare, who's the world's leading foremost expert in psychopathology at the University of British Columbia, the more it was like, okay, this is starting to make so many sense to me about like things that happened in Ireland during the Troubles when I was growing up, and why people could do this and have no conscience. And it started to dawn on me, just like they already knew this in academia, but they never really told us, that approximately 1% of the human race in the Western world are purely psychopathic. They're like a different species that lives amongst us. They're a different kind of human being. And then when you go up into big business, corporations, the top of media, it's about 4%. So even where they were clustered, it's still quite small. But if you're, say, 30 or 40 and you've had a normal life, working jobs, load of relationships, the usual bullshit you deal with in life, the chances are you'll have met at least one. And you may not have known it. And then as I developed this thing, I started to think to myself, well, how come I was never told this? I was told about schizophrenics, I was told about bipolar, autistics, I was told about everything. But this one thing that was the most dangerous of them all, and the most dangerous because they're good at hiding. And remember, it's pathology. That means they're dangerous, they're pathological. How come we were never told this? And then I started to think about politics and politicians, how they changed their personalities like that to get voted. How politicians don't feel like, so many politicians when you see them on TV, especially when you meet them in the flesh, if they're coming around looking for your vote, they don't feel like other people. You don't have the same rapport with them. And then you kind of think to yourself, oh, well, maybe because they're of a different social status than me, they're very well educated. But even if they're not, they feel different. Certain people in media and stuff like that. And it started to dawn on me then that the Western civilization functioned in such a way that these pathological individuals were given the upper hand over the rest of us. And this was the problem with Western society. And more importantly, they knew this was the problem. But because they run the show, big pharma, politics, mass media, education, you name it, they were doing everything to make sure that we didn't know this. So there was all talk about this among themselves. And then when fMRI and brain imaging technology came out, they discovered that the psychopath's brain was even completely different than a human brain under imaging technology like CAT scans. That they were mostly active in the lower reptilian brain stem, the reptilian cortex and the lower brain stem. And the frontal partitions of their brain, the prefrontal human brain, where empathy, compassion, emotions, and dreams and creativity was literally switched off. And you could actually see on the brain imaging that their limbic regions, I'm going to be talking about brain science a lot tonight, don't worry, it's going to be, I'll make it easy for you. The limbic regions and the amygdala, which are like the gearbox of the brain. Now, how they function is, if I say you're talking to that girl there and your wallet is there, right? And I was thinking to myself, there's probably 100 quid in that. Easy money. A normal person, a normal human being, goes through the process. Their limbic region says, our instincts as animals is to go, to steal it, kill or be killed, because my reptilian complex might be saying that. But the limbic region is going, you'll get caught. It won't work out. Everyone else here will hate me. I'll have to make a run for it. This is how your brain works. And then because we have a modern frontal brain, that kicks in and that says, it would be wrong to do that to you because that might be your only money for the week. So you see, the reptile, the mammal, and then the human. That's how our brains work. There's a 3-stage process. The psychopath doesn't think like that. The limbic region and the amygdala are switched off. So there's no gearbox. They go serious from 0 to 90 instantaneously. And the psychopath would see your wallet and he would think to himself, he'd look around and he'd say, that this young lady here would see me. Screw it, I won't do it. But if you turned away for a second, you would do that. And there would be no thought about that would be your money for the week. You couldn't pay your rent. You couldn't pay your gas bill. That would not come into your mind. So a psychopath is a person who has no compassion, no empathy, because the frontal cortex is switched off. It's not damaged, it's switched off. And they choose not to use it. It's literally be shown they choose not to use it. The only reason that he stops himself from stealing it is because in the past he tried that and someone punched him, or he was caught and he had to make a run for it. It's not morality, it's learned instinct. Very different. Not thinking about you, he's thinking about you beating me up, that kind of a thing. And that's how they think. They're like animals. It's a reptilian mind in action. And this is what these people felt like to work with them. Now, well, I was a graphic designer there, so I wasn't evil, okay? So I wasn't involved in anything evil in that business when I was working on Wall Street. My job was just pure to make documents and presentations and stuff like that. One day, there was with the 2 of these people I told you about that the guy pointed out, and we were looking through the reports, and it was the nationalization of a power plant in Honduras, and there was going through the expenses, and I was going down the list, and I said, with this for the, so many millions to buy the plant, so many millions to upgrade the transmission system, so many millions to hire new staff. And then at the end, it's something like the ancillary war chest, it was called. And I asked the guy, I said, what's that for? Because it wasn't listed. And the 2 of them burst out laughing. And he says, well, that's to pay the local mafia to kill the union leaders. And that was happening in a so-called respectable bank. That was a moment in my life that the world, why it was evil, made sense. Because the ones who are running it are evil. They're bad. They're dangerous. They're psychopaths. The rest of us don't know this. And that's why the human race doesn't function. So then, this was always playing in my mind for years, thinking about it. And then I started making a couple of YouTube videos. And they got like really big hits in a very short time. And I said I should really write a book about this. But I'm not an academic. So if I wrote a book about psychopaths, because I don't have a PhD on the end, everyone will laugh at it. So I'll write a novel. So my first idea was to write a novel. And it was about psychopaths as monsters, as like demons, hunting in a Wall Street investment bank. And I thought that was great. That's the way I can do it. I can spill it out in our allegory and metaphor, like our ancestors used to do with fairy tales and stuff. So I created a blog, and I start just randomly writing these stories. Jeff was 39 years of age. And then suddenly I'm getting emails and comments. Oh, I was married to him. I knew her. I worked with him. And this suddenly all this information start cascading into my PMs and into my email box of all these people saying, what you described here, I knew somebody like that. And then it dawned on me how similar they all are, because they're not creative, they're not dynamic, but they're very sneaky and they're very devious. And they all follow a certain plan. And then I was thinking, well, and then they were all saying to me, why are you wasting your time writing a horror novel write a guidebook. So I wrote a book called Puzzling People, The Labyrinth of the Psychopath. It became like this cult classic, people from housewives to bankers, and it just was unbelievable. It took off. And I was even getting letters and emails from academics and scientists saying, you nailed it. You nailed it, and you said what we couldn't say. Because there was a book I read not long before called The Sociopath Next Door. Sociopath is another term they use for it, because they invented that. Because what happened was they used to always use psychopath, and then Alfred Hitchcock made the movie Psycho, and then it became that everyone thought it was violent. So they said, let's come up with a name for the non-violent ones, because most are not violent, and they came up with sociopath. So she wrote a book called The Sociopath Next Door. And in the book, I was reading it, and what she was saying was, she was trying to tell us, Dr. Martha Stout, that the Bush administration was made up of psychopaths. But because she's a Harvard academic, she could not come out and say, the US government, the Bush administration are psychopaths. Then that's because that is why they make these people academics, so they play the game. And so I said, well, that's great, I'm just going to come right and say it. And so like I wrote the book. Now I didn't mention people directly other than, because I don't like pointing the finger, but I did mention certain individuals who obviously demonstrated these traits. Henry Kissinger was one I mentioned in the book. Former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was one who softened up Iraq by imposing sanctions and starved to death and killed 400,000 children. And she said, it was worth it. No feelings, no emotions, just business. And that's the title of tonight's talk. Because that's what you want to understand, how the psychopathic mind works. It's just business. If they have to kill someone to get something, they will. If they have to rob someone, they'll do it. And I'll give you, and they're extremely dangerous. They're very, very dangerous. Even the ones who are not violent, and you might work with them, they will do things because there is no morality fail-safe switch. There's no brakes. And they will do anything. That's why I always tell people, if you think you're working with one, under no circumstances try to challenge them. Don't pull them up against the wall. I know you are. Because they'll do things like they'll stay in the office late at night and they'll put child porn on your computer and then call the police. That's how low they will sink. They just don't have morality. They don't have decency. So I started doing interviews on shows like your own, like Paul there, and I was coming out and saying things like that. Tony Blair's a psychopath. He absolutely demonstrates that perfectly. He seems to have no real personality. He makes you feel uncomfortable. He started a war with George Bush over weapons of mass destruction that didn't happen, refused to apologise for what all mayhem had caused, and this is very important later, we're going to talk later, and then became a Catholic to make him seem like, to absolve himself, and also to try and get the job as the European president, because the European Union is predominantly a Catholic organisation. So here was all the things of a classic psychopath. One, we don't really know the background of Tony Blair. It's kind of a very odd kind of background. He just seems to have arrived out of nowhere and then suddenly be Prime Minister. Very quickly it happened. That means there's a past there we don't know about. That's very common with all psychopaths, even the one that lives down the street from you. You can never get to the truth of their past. Invented personas. He invents personas. When he first got elected, you remember when he had the Spice Girls and Oasis at 10 Downing Street, he went in there carrying his electric guitar. Remember that? It looked so fake to us, didn't it? I'm the rock and roll Prime Minister. And we're all laughing at him, but he, in his mind, thinks, I'm making everyone, they're all suckers, they'll fall for this. They think I play my guitar inside number 10 because I'm a that's the false image, the false persona. Surrounding himself with the trappings of being a great guy, pop stars. Next thing you know, the war thing starts. He doesn't think about the consequences for the UK, British troops, the image of the UK. He wants to help George Bush because he sees the winning team. Psychopaths always go for the winning team. Their hyper impulsivity. Whatever they think will get them to win, they'll go for it. So he goes into the Iraq war thing, the weapons of mass destruction, it's all fake, it all turns out to be a nightmare. he doesn't apologize for the mess that he's created. That's another thing. You will never get a psychopath ever, ever, ever to say sorry. Doesn't matter if you're married to them, worked with one, whatever they did that was so bad, they will never say sorry. You might get, I'm sorry you feel that way, but that puts the thing back on you. You know, they'll always divert it away from something else, but you'll never get a direct apology. They're hardwired never to say sorry, and there's a reason for this. Because there's no personality in there. There's nothing inside a psychopath. I've interviewed two of them for that book, Defeated Demons. They told me they don't feel like they're in there. They just feel like a shell. They feel empty inside. And when they hear people talking about emotions and feelings, to them that's like, what are you talking about? You might as well be talking about some complex science. They don't get it. There's nothing in there. So they create these false personas. And they move from persona to persona. Just like an actor playing one role, Macbeth one year, Hamlet the next, King Lear the following year. What happens is when Tony Blair bombed Iraq and then became a Catholic, the one that bombed Iraq, that version of Tony Blair, wasn't responsible for the other one. So you understand, how can a psychopath apologize when there's a new version of them inside here? This is very spooky stuff, but this is what they tell you. They cannot understand why the previous version of them should make amends for the current version should make amends for the previous version. And this is why people look at the likes of Kissinger and Blair and go, oh my God, how can they be so hypocritical? How could they be such hypocrites? But it's not hypocrisy. They're literally, the new version is in town. Yeah, the skin suit is there, not the same voice, but he has a new version. He's created a new persona, and his new persona is the great statesman Catholic who now goes around the world with his Tony Blair Foundation, having all faith, you know, all happiness between faith and all this, even though he bombed, blew up families and everything. And that's what they're all like. He's an extreme example, but they're all like that. Even the local politician will be like that. Now that's why this is what makes this so important. This is the issue. Forget everything else. This is it. This is the core issue of what's wrong with the world. Why we vote for politicians who will promise you anything, and as soon as they get elected into power, what happens? I never said that. They all do it, from the local councillor up to the top. So many of them are like that. They make the most incredible, and that's what psychopaths do. They will promise you the sun, moon, the stars, give you a bag of rubbish, and then say, I never said that. And that's why people are so incensed by the political system. They can't get it. And this goes through our culture, through politics, through media. How we're now, have you noticed how we're now bombarded with celebrity culture? We have a new star every week. This is what that's all about. We're getting an insight into how they think. There's no long-term anything anymore. Everything is quick like this. Because that's how a psychopath, what am I this week? Who am I this week? What am I next week? That's what they think. And that's why we can no longer keep up with all these celebrities they give us. It goes very deep into society. They're running everything now. They're running everything because the system has been created. Now, when I started getting out and talking about this stuff, I thought I'd write that book and no one would ever hear about me ever again. And that was okay. It got it out of my heart and out of my soul. And suddenly it took off really big, and I was on the radio constantly. And I'm traveling all over Europe doing talks. And I'm meeting people from every walk of life in all kinds of towns, and they're riveted to what I'm saying, because they start going, I knew someone just like that. And if you don't hear it right away, you'll remember later on. And it's very intense stuff when you first hear it, and it can be quite frightening, because when you start realizing that you've actually been around people like this. But it's so powerful to know this stuff, because once you know the dangers of something, then you know how to escape it. And that was the purpose of Puzzling People. The first book was written in a very direct manner. It was just a toolkit. Here's what's wrong with the world. Here's what they're called, psychopaths. Here's how you identify them, and here's how you get away from them. It was like, my attitude was, if you suddenly found yourself on a desert island, you don't want a 700-page tome on how the geology formed the island, how all the plants came about. You want, how do I survive? What can I eat? and how do I make shelter to keep me alive until I'm rescued. So that was the idea of that book. No one had come up with that. And it did well for me, and it got me a name out there. But what amazed me was, as I did this, and I brought this, I'm not just saying me, a few others had done it. Suddenly people like John Ronson are talking about it in the mainstream, but they're trivializing it. Yeah, psychopaths exist, but they're very few. But people started saying, yeah, but there's still a problem. And now the new thing they seem to be doing now is telling us that psychopaths are good for the world. Called The Wisdom of Psychopaths. The world is a great place because of psychopaths. We'd be lost without them. So they try to, first they deny it, then they trivialize it, and then they say, it's just not a problem. It's great. Now, how similar to that is the people when they wake up? What's the first reaction you get? They say it doesn't exist, you're mad. Then they laugh at you. And then they say to you, well, the world's always been crazy, that kind of thing. We live in a world where we've been molded around the image of them, and we don't know it. And we don't know what they are. Now, you can't go around the street going, he's a psychopath, it doesn't work like that. We're not all Van Helsings looking for vampires. It doesn't work that way. But you can be aware of someone for a long time that may demonstrate these traits. And I always say, the only way to deal with it is get the hell away from them. Do not try to reason with them, it'll never happen. Save your life, get away, start begin again, and no contact ever again. And my attitude now with the control system is the same. We have a dysfunctional political, economic system. Get away from it. Beginning. And this is what this alternative movement, whatever you want to call it, that's what this is. People who instinctually know that the system is polluted. And that's why we're breaking away, having meetings like this, reading new kinds of literature, learning about etymology, learning about symbolism, learning about gardening, learning about organic foods and all kinds of things, because we are somehow breaking away. We instinctively know, even though we didn't have the term psychopath to name it, we knew something was wrong with the world. And we were breaking away almost like another tribe, because we didn't have a name to term it, and the term is the psychopath. Now, why I came out about this? Well, I have to say I was always kind of woken up, because I started getting into this stuff from a very early age. I remember I was reading Chomsky and Gore Vidal books when I was back, my teens, late teens, early 20s. So I read like books like David Gallup's In God's Name, about propaganda due in the Vatican connection to the mafia. So I knew a lot about this stuff. So I didn't have that explosion of the wake up thing that a lot of people get, and suddenly the world is run by crazies. But what was happening then was, I was noticing that I would go onto like YouTube and I would look, are people woken up? Are they interested in this stuff? And I was finding lots of people, especially in 2008, 2009, there was a massive explosion. But they were talking about things like aliens and lizards. And to me, that was a trap you were going back into. It's no point, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying it's a deliberate trap, but it's no point if you realise that the world, see what happens then, you're externalising yourself. They're an alien, they're a lizard. They're demons possessed Babylonian doll, inbred, and that could be true too. I'm not saying it isn't, but that's not a practical thing you can sell to other people. If you were the fella at work and I found out the world was crazy and then someone told me it's because they're shape-shifting lizards, if I walked up to you, you'd have every right to laugh at me. As much as that would hurt me, what do you expect a normal person to do? What do you expect that? And that always felt like a very dangerous thing to me. But if you can walk up to someone and you say to them, look, the money system, like in Ireland, we've been destroyed by the IMF. I can walk up to people in Dublin or any Irish city and I'll say, isn't it disgusting what happened? And they go, yeah, why are they doing that? And I would say, well, because they're psychopaths. And they say, what's a psychopath? People have no conscience, they're only interested in business, and they'll do anything to get it. Really, and they're interested. That's a very different thing than walking up to someone and saying they're aliens from the Draconian Nebula. But it happened to friends of mine, and they were really hurt by that, and they realised later on that, oh my God, I should have kept my mouth shut. Or else they watched like really bad conspiracy films, and they saw stuff that could be easily disproven, even if the conspiracy was true. You have to remember, they're very clever. It could be easily disproven to make it look like the mainstream story, and the mainstream would have vast amounts of stuff to pull on, and you might have a clip on YouTube, and suddenly you get mocked again, and you look like a nutcase to them, and you feel like a nutcase. And there's two reactions to that. One is you say, oh, shit, I should have wished I'd never listened to that stuff. I want my old life back with my mates and everything. Or you go deeper into it and you call them sheeple. You know, they're all sheeple. Or maybe they're reptilians. You know, that happens to some people. And the really bad ones who are really ridiculed of you, you might say they're psychopaths. That's why we can't have witch hunts. So I felt that the world needed, well, not the world, but this alternative movement badly needed a common sense, scientifically validated, remember, this is their science being used against them, in such a way that you could sell it to them, where you say, psychopaths, that's not true, and you say, oh, Google it. Go to the University of British Columbia, read Dr. Hare's Without Conscience. Look up there, this stuff is real. Read The Mask of Sanity. The mainstream are trying to own the subject because we're well ahead of them on this one. We've actually pulled out something here that we're well ahead of them on. And, you know, we frightened the crap out of them, I think, because they were very happy when you're talking about lizards. They're very happy when you're talking about aliens. They're very happy when you're talking about, you know, Satanists under Balmoral Castle drinking babies' blood. They love when you talk about that because it just makes you look like a maniac. But they don't want you talking about stuff that they know about. And they want ownership of it. They want their people running it. So we're well ahead of them on this one. So anyway, I felt that was the way to sell us, our movement. Not in an evangelical way, but if you could just say to somebody, this is the reason why, not talking about pyramids, eyes on all that stuff. That's all okay, it's interesting and all that stuff, but that's not the answer. And this was a way I felt that we could almost, as a movement, get a kind of a legitimacy. You understand? Where you could sit down and you could actually, you know, the basics of brain science you could whip out, and suddenly you don't look like an idiot. You look like a smart person, because a lot of people don't know about the amygdala and the limbic region. They don't know. They do. They might have heard about the reptilian complex, but you could turn around, and it also helps people who say, because there's an element of that could be true, but there's a reptile in our brain. It's an early evolutionary brain, so that's a way of kind of validating that as well. So it all comes full circle, and then that started to happen. People started saying, "Oh yeah, this is a good one. I like this idea. I like what I'm hearing here about psychopaths. It's a good one." And then you could say, walk up to your mate in work, say your brother was married to somebody, and she was like she just drove him bananas, did terrible things to him, abused him and everything, and she showed no compassion. You may read through my books or other books, and you may say, God, she was a psychopath. She follows, everything is perfect. And then you can say to your friend, your brother, you can tell him about this, and you might give him healing. And then he may have had no interest in the alternative stuff, and you could say, it's not just personal relationships, you can scale it up to the big thing. So when everything else in this alternative movement is the big stuff scaled down, it's impossible to scale the big stuff down to the person on the street. But if you can find a frame of reference that someone in their life has suffered abuse by one of these people, or worked with them or knew them, you can then scale that up to the control system. Very, very powerful. You're unlocking the keys to a global awakening that we can actually use, rather than a global awakening that makes us into a tribe. We have to sort of not be careful not to ghettoize ourselves. That's why what happens, a lot of people when they first break up, it's the same thing as when they become born again Christians. They have to tell everybody. I've seen it. I've gone to events and you see people, and it's, you know, they're really wired because they've got this new information, because suddenly they're finding clues, they're coming true, and the world is starting to make sense, but they don't have the frame of reference to actually sell it to another person. And that's what hurts so much. And they might say things like, and spiritual awakenings are the same way too. And this is something I'm very interested in now. But you know, they may say things like, "Oh, well, the fellas at work don't believe me because they have cognitive dissonance." See, they want us to ghettoize ourselves. They want us to look like fools and be alienated from our friends and our family and our workmates. because that's how psychopaths think. They're very big into smear campaigns. For instance, if I was in a relationship with you and we broke up and I was a psychopath and I got money off you or something, right? I got your house, because that's the only reason they go into relationships, right? The first thing I would do is, when it was over, right before it was over, I would film rumours. I would tell you she's an alcoholic. She's an alcoholic. Don't say she's an alcoholic. You may never touch a drink in your life. You understand? So when I jump ship with your money, you're shocked from that to begin with. But at the same time too, you're hearing these terrible rumours about you, and you're too busy trying to defend your humanity to these people. I'm gone. I'm run away. That's what they use the smear campaigns for. Look over here. Now you look at the politics and how the media works. They're always running smear campaigns to take your eye off the ball. And you in this country, right now in the middle of one of the best ones ever, well, one of the worst ones I've ever seen. All these TV stars are all being pulled up and sensationalized. It's who's next, you know? It's like Paul O'Grady said, it's Andy Pandy next, you know? One Mr. Ben. It's one after the other, all these 70 stars. There's two reasons for that. One is to destroy your faith in your culture. And that'll make you, you know, was everyone we grew up with a paedophile? Is my whole life gone? Did it mean nothing? And then the Euroborg comes to get you. So they destroyed our culture in Ireland in a different way. But that's what they're doing here with you guys. Two things. The other one is to hide bigger crimes. So when everyone's all in a tizzy over some TV star from the 70s and the media's having their frenzy, that is to take the eye off the ball of something else they're doing. And I can guarantee you right now, the British government is doing something really intense, and it's all been hidden behind these tabloid headlines. I don't know if they're demolishing you're selling off your NHS on the side, looking for another war, but I can guarantee you, you will wake up one day and the NHS will be gone, and everyone will say, how the hell did that happen? It happened because you were all going crazy over Max Clifford or Rolf Harris. They made you the magician's sleight of hand. That's what the psychopath does. It creates a diversion. So you're too busy worried about something else. It creates smear campaigns, so you cannot get your act together. So by the time the change has happened, it's too late. And you're too busy trying to, well, how come we didn't have former people's movement to do this? Where'd this come from? You understand? And then it's too late, because why? The media was filling the news with all these celebrity stories of all these washed up celebrities from the 70s. Only a psychopath thinks like that. Only a psychopath has that kind of mind. Because a normal person would say, if we had normal politicians and they said, okay, we really can't afford the NHS right now, a lot of old people, what do? Well, we tell the truth to the people. We say the NHS is approaching bankruptcy, okay? There's a choice here. Some kind of, we raise your taxes just to pay for that, or we do something else. We offer up a kind of private insurance plan. We're trying to help you save it. No, they won't see it that way. They'll just see the profit of selling these hospitals and all these other centres off. That's all they'll ever see. So that's how a psychopath thinks. The psychopath is very impulsive because of testosterone. Psychopaths seem to have high levels of the hormone testosterone. The hormone testosterone leads to impulsivity. They're very impulsive. This is often what gives them away. They're also addicted to adrenaline and to the hormone, the neurotransmitter dopamine. And I'm going to give you an example of that. There's a thing called Duper's Delight. It was actually named by Robert Hare at the University of British Columbia. Where studying psychopaths in the clinic, he noticed if they got away with something, there was a smirk. And he said it was like an autoferal impulse. That's what I called it. But that's what I described it as. No matter what, if the psychopath got their way and duped you, you got this. A smirk. Now lots of people smirk. Doesn't mean you're a psychopath. But they always do it. They've always got this, so many of them, when you start looking at their photographs, the smirk on their face, like this shit-eating grin, they call it, like screw you grin. And what causes that is, whenever they get their way, they get in a rush of adrenaline and they get a rush of dopamine. Dopamine is the same thing that happens, it's a pleasure hormone. When you're laughing and you're having a good time, adrenaline is exciting, it's a rush. And it affects the muscles in their face and somehow pulls the lip up on one side, depending if they're left or right-handed. The smirk, look out for the smirk. You see it in so many politicians, you see it in so many powerful media people. You'll see it in so many of their photographs. Like there was one thing where they had, what was the name of that thing here, where they had the Leveson inquiry, is that what it was called? Where they had the media all investigated and, you know, and I think was that the one where the newspapers were all found out to be, yeah. And there was one guy who was pulled up on that. I don't know what, I think he worked for the Express. He was found a large amount of money, but outside the courthouse he was like this. Well, he might have got found £40,000, but what he did was probably worth 30 years in prison. But he knew it, he got it. Those great stories I read about. You see, this is one of the great things about when I started doing this, there was nothing out there, there was very few books. So I started looking other places, and then I read things on profiles of serial killers and things like the Manson family. And I read this book on a guy who used to work the electric chair at Sing Sing prison in upstate New York. So he pulled the switch on loads of murderers and killers and stuff. And he said that you could always tell who the psychopaths were. They just didn't care. They would just walk up to the electric chair. They just didn't care. Sit in the electric chair. And he told one story of one guy who was a psychopath, and he said right before he was electrocuted, he stole the prison officer's cigarettes out of his pocket. Put them in his pocket. Went. Do you remember the movie Gangs of New York? Right before they had the hanging. Remember they had the hanging to appease the people, the rich people uptown, and Daniel Day-Lewis is standing there, and they're bringing they just grab 5 poor bastards off the street to hang them, and one of them, he says, get 5 people who are not popular, no one cares about them. So that would have been, it's like the low-level psychopaths, and the guy's going by, and Daniel Day-Lewis, he's about to be hanged, and Daniel Day-Lewis says, how are you doing, Sean, whatever his name is, and he goes, I'm all right. He says, I'll give you $1 for that watch. It's the guy to be hanged. And he goes, it's my mother, you know, I got that watch from my mother. Daniel Day-Lewis goes, I'll give you $2 for it. And he goes, okay, he takes the watch off. And Daniel Day-Lewis gets him $2. And then he goes and gets hanged. That's how the psychopathic mind thinks. They live in the moment. It's one rush to the next. There's no sense of internal self-reflection. When you go to bed at night, what do? You lie in bed for a few minutes and you process your thoughts of the day. Who hurt me? What annoyed me? Where's my life going? Who are my friends? Have I done the right things in life? You know, was I wrong to dump that guy? Was I wrong to break that girl's heart? Where's my life going? Who will pay for my retirement, my old age? Self-reflection, and then you fall into sleep. A psychopath gets into bed and falls asleep like this. It's a machine shutting off. They have no sense of internal self-reflection. This is why Bram Stoker used the metaphor of the psychopath as the vampire. And the metaphor was, Dracula couldn't see himself in the mirror. He could not self-reflect. It's like a robot. And this ties so big into the whole transhumanist thing. Everything like GMOs, the works. They can't look at themselves in the mirror. They can't self-reflect. They have no internal personality construct. They're only copies. A moving flesh robot, driven by an addiction to a dopamine, adrenaline, and the testosterone. So that's why they're so dangerous, because they want, every one of them thinks they're the king of the world. They won't, some of them will actually say it, they can get away with it. But they all think they're the greatest in the world. It's pure ego that way. They think that they're smarter than everyone else. They can fool anyone. And that was why, if they were all, you know, if all that was left in the world was, say, that the most 1,000 famous psychopaths, powerful ones in all the banks and everything, and they would all kill each other until there was one guy left standing on the pile of baddies going, yes. He wouldn't care that there was no one else to serve him. All he was driven by was to be number one. This is why our businesses are psychopathic. Why do you think you have mergers and acquisitions? Enron's, General Motors started out making cars, now it makes everything. Monsanto absolutely is a psychopathic. It wants to own life itself. What kind of a mind thinks of Terminator seeds? Seeds that kill themselves after one rotate? A normal person wouldn't think that. But a psychopath who wants extra money every year would absolutely do that. A psychopath who runs Monsanto's or runs in there would have no problem bankrupting farmers who accidentally had Monsanto seeds fall into their field and contaminate their crop. The normal person doesn't think like that. The psychopath does. Just business. So what makes a psychopath? Okay, this is a real big one. Psychopaths, it's been an assumption that they're genetic. It's in the genes. There's a genetic predisposition. There's a genetic switch trigger somehow. It's switched on. Passed down from family to family. This is what science, mainstream science, is obsessed with trying to sell us. But I got news for you. There's very little or no proof of it. Very little or no proof of it. There's a hell of a lot of wishful thinking. And there are some studies with twins, but they're not that black and white. In fact, there's very other good studies with twins regarding epigenetics, which shows that two twins are raised by two families. One, say, the natural family, and one a foster family, and they don't know they're twins. Even if they're identical twins, genetically identical, the one who's not raised is quite different than the one. So you'll not have the same hereditary diseases because she doesn't know about them. This has now been, this is called epigenetics, that you actually switch on gene sequences in your brain by your thoughts. There's now a neurological cause and effect. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake talks about the Genome Project. He quoted the work of Dr. Steve Jones, Professor Steve Jones at University College London. The guy basically said their genes are not that important. What the Genome Project uncovered was that there is no hereditary factor. That was the golden key. And that was what all these biotech companies were all investing in. They were all investing in the hope that every single thing in your personality, you're the way you are because you have a bit of your mom's personality and a bit of your dad's personality. But even if you didn't know them and were raised by a foster family, according to what they wanted to believe, you still had their things. That comes out the kind of Darwinism, eugenics kind of thing. That's when you start looking into it, it's not there. It's not that cut and dry. So I'm not saying it's not genetic, but so far I'm not going to say it until the proof is in. It's not in. Even though it seems to run in these aristocratic families, it may not necessarily be genetic. It may be a cultural thing within that family. I'll give you an example. About 10 years ago I was working in Milan, and on the weekends off, because I'm an artist and I'm mad for like history and paintings and stuff, I used to go visit the aristocratic homes around Lake Garda and all those places, and I'd go see the paintings and stuff in the houses where these noble Italians from the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance lived. And I always noticed in many of the houses there were paintings of horrible battle scenes, right? Prisoners having their throats cut, after the victory. And then there was even one that had an outbreak of a plague among the peasants in Umbria, and the peasants were all dying and they were burying them. But they were always shaped on the top like this, curved on top. So I asked the Italian guy, why do you like that? And he says they were headboards. They were beds. And when an Italian noble couple of the same tribe married, the same clan, they would give them a gift of a headboard for their conceiving their children, which would show the scenes of the sufferings of enemies. And they would also build them into babies' cribs. Now, would you grow up normal in a house like that? They were raised. I'll give you another example of that. When I was about 19, I met this girl, and she was really anti-fox hunting in Ireland. So she took me some hot fox hunting thingies, and I didn't really know what fox hunting was, except a bunch of Egypts in red coats going on horses. And then the first time I ever saw a fox hunt up close, it terrified the hell out of me. It's so violent in terms of noise and energy, the horns, the dogs going crazy, the sound of the horses, it's very intense. And there in the middle of it all, are two 9-year-old kids on a little pony with all this sensory, you know, this sort of kind of like maelstrom around them. And then one of the things in Kildare we found, I saw the fox running and the dogs went after it, and then I heard on the other side of a hedgerow the fox being torn asunder. And the screams, it was like nothing I'd ever heard in my life. It was like the gates of hell being open. And that was bad enough. And then there was like a pub down the road, and they all would go down there for their gin and tonics. The kids got their lemonade, and I saw the two 9-year-old kids. Blood here, and blood here, and blood here. So what the hell is that? And it's called blooding. And what happens is they take the flesh of the fox, which is filled with adrenaline because of the terror it's gone through. They wipe it on the child's face, and because it's got a kid's skin is so gentle, it can absorb. Often doctors, pediatricians will put medicine on kids' baby skin because it can get it in there. It's more safer than oral. So that death energy, whatever you want to call it, was absorbed into that child's body. That could explain why they're like this, why they're so cruel, along with things like they're raised in privilege. They think we're all scum. It doesn't have to be genetic. It could be sexual violence. They all go to these private boys' schools, and we all know what happens in the showers in Harrow and Eton. They lose their virginity to the older boys, usually in gang rapes and beatings. This may be why there's so much coldness within them. But there would also be real psychopaths in there too. But what this would be doing would be creating what I call proto-psychopaths. A proto-psychopath would be someone who's not a psychopath. Naturally, they're not born that way. But they may have become one. Say someone who was raised in a bad war situation. Like if you were a normal kid and a drone flew over and you saw your family blown up, well, wouldn't you want to become a bomber or something like that? Wouldn't you want to become a fighter? And wouldn't you be hard and hate Westerners and infidels? I saw it happen in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, you know, Catholics and Protestants. You made that, they're normal people. If you could get them out of there, you could reform them. Or kids who grew up in tough neighbourhoods are often like that. And like nasty, you know, the kids who hang outside the off licence and stuff, and they can be seen very cruel, hitting the pensioners and stuff. They could come from terrible families. But if you get those kids and you can fix them, you can't fix a psychopath. So it's not hereditary from what I can tell. There are proto-psychopaths, but they're normal people who've been damaged in some way. Maybe they were abused as children or something. You can fix them. You can't fix a pure psychopath. So they just seem to arrive. They're almost like a predatory savant. Like, you know, these kids who are born into families with no musical training, and the kid's a fantastic piano player. He doesn't even have to learn music. They just stick him at the piano and he starts knocking out Beethoven and Mozart. Those kids do exist. Or families where there's no sport in the family. They're all unhealthy, and then one kid is born and he's a fantastic rugby player, footballer, Olympic runner. They seem to be just like that. I know this is kind of frightening and scary, but remember, it's 1%. This is not common. And they're just born out of the blue to normal families. There was an article in the New York Times a year and a half, 2 years ago, where they showed this place in Florida where they got kids who'd been identified as psychopathic. You see, they start as kids. And they were noticed by school teachers to be very cruel and manipulative of other kids. They put them all in this centre, and all these kids were identified as psychopaths. They did neuroimaging on them. And it's quite frightening to think that these children are not born pure and innocent. They're born predators. And they found that these kids had all the classic traits, how they manipulated, deceitful, devious, but they also would find out things that the family members were normal. They came from normal parents. There was no evidence of psychopathology in the grandparents as far as they could tell, and all their siblings were normal kids. It's so spooky. It's almost like a sort of if you're one of the people who believes that consciousness is not local to the human body, and our consciousness is literally just basically using our human body as a spacesuit to explore this reality, there's almost like, well, I mean, this could be something that really should be looked at. But there could be predatory consciousnesses. Why wouldn't it be? The universe is dualist. Positive, negative, male, female, up, down, black, white. It's all dualist, right? So why wouldn't it be positive consciousness, negative consciousness? Then there would be an evolutionary mandate to this. Very interesting. We could spend all night talking about this, but I'll just go, just another thing out there. So it's the psychopath, what caused them, we don't know. They just seem to ride its 1%. But it's that 1% can, one psychopath in his life or her life, remember there's female psychopaths too, can do unbelievable damage even if they don't get into a position of power. They can break 100 people's hearts. They can walk away from 10 families. They can leave a trail of misery, destruction and heartbreak behind them and walk around not a care in the world, not a care in the world. And other people are thinking, you know, his ex-girlfriend, he left her with 3 kids. She ended up becoming a nervous wreck and then committing suicide. And he doesn't give a shit. I've identified what the psychopath is. This is a real thing. Now, to believe me, there's a mountain of academic literature out there. This is the challenge that we as a species are facing. This is what's behind it all. These are a different kind of human being, but this is not a witch hunt because we're going to be smarter than them. But we're not going to go after them, tag them, identify them, put yellow stars on them. They do that to us. None of that crap. Not witch hunts, burning them, none of that stuff. We're going to literally, the only way we're going to survive this is by becoming aware that they exist, and that way they won't bother to go run for office. Because if everyone has this skill and knows what they're like, if there's any way a psychopath can be frightened, it's fear of exposure. Psychopaths are terrified. It's not a fear like they worry about it. Well, they do worry about it. It's more like an anxiety. But they're like an animal. They're like, imagine like a lizard running through the desert. It's looking up to see if there's an eagle nearby. Well, that's what a psychopath is like. They live in fear of detection. And the only reason they've been able to get so high up in politics and business and media is because our ignorance has been their power. And now we're learning about them. And they're going to say, shag it, I'm not going to run for politics. I'm not going to run for office because they'll know me, they'll see me. People will be aware. I'm already seeing it on the internet. Oh, he looks like a bit of a psychopath. I don't like what he got up to. He had a company that bankrupted and now he's like, you know, he says 4 or 5 bankruptcies behind him. He's had 2 wives, one of them died under mysterious sentence. You know, the other one ended up in a mental hospital. And people start thinking these things. They're not going to start running for office. We can actually, and as soon as we can identify this and say that's a psychopathic business model, they don't want that. They're really afraid of being found out. It's just like a vampire is afraid of the dawn. And the more I see this, and the reason why I do this, is because what Carl Jung said, we do not become enlightened beings by imagining happiness and light. We become enlightened beings by making the darkness conscious. So by going into the shadow of ourselves, the shadow of mankind, then we can start facing things and it's wrong. Every motif, every mythology always talks about the hero going into the labyrinth, into the cave, Orpheus in the underworld. You know, Dante's Inferno. These myths have lasted because they're telling us about us as people. They go in there, the Minotaur, into the cave. They identify the problem. They slay it, and then they come back into the world. As they step into sunlight, they're enlightened. So we're now going from, if you look at it, they say we compare it to the conspiracy mode. We first learned a few years ago that maniacs ran the system, that all the laws, everything was a lie, everything in the system was a lie. We went on to YouTube, we went into the darkness. We looked around and now we realized it's the psychopath in the dark. Now we can come out of the darkness and we are now enlightened. We now have the language and the term and the work to use against them. And that's how we can enlighten the people. So that's the psychopath. It's not a witch hunt. Don't get paranoid. Don't diagnose yourself. We've all been idiots in our lives. We've all been creeps. We've all broken people's hearts. We've all done things we shouldn't. The difference between us and a psychopath is we feel bad about it. We don't like the fact we may have hurt or damaged somebody. We feel guilty about it. They don't give a shit. They just don't care. And when you put those people in politics and big business and media, that's the world we have today. Okay, thanks very much.